Welcome to our YouTube channel, where we break barriers and foster inclusivity in STEM education. Join us as we delve into the transformative landscape of learning environments with Dr. Logan Jin, Assistant Director for STEM at Brown University. Get ready to explore innovations, engage in dialogue, and empower graduate students with disabilities. Let's ensure every voice is heard and every mind is empowered.
So I'm Feliz Zubair, the Allied Project Manager for those of you who don't already know. Thank you for being a part of yet another event from the Allied Talk series. So Allied stands for Allies for Leading Learning, Inclusion and Education of Disabilities. And here we advocate for discussions around different topics related to disabilities. Let me take this moment to welcome our special guest speaker, Dr. Logan Jin, or may I say the Assistant Director of STEM at Brown University. Logan is here to talk about challenges and opportunities for students with disabilities in different learning environments like active learning, online instructions, and undergrad research. Let me also take this moment to welcome our director, Dr. Mona Mankara, and let's go. And also our co-directors, Dr. Sandra Shefferman, and all of you for being present here today. Sit back, relax, and grab a snack, and let's begin the event.
Great. Yeah, well, again, thank you. I will just begin with a brief visual description of me. So today I'm wearing a maroon sweater. I have kind of shorter brown hair with clear colored glasses and a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow, even though it's only 2 o'clock today. But it's really an honor to be here. I will also say that I identify as having a physical disability. I have dwarfism, so I use crutches and a mobility scooter to get around. And I'll talk a little bit about how this informs kind of my own approach to this work and kind of my own perspectives as a someone who navigated science curriculum and science careers. So I'm also just going to begin by acknowledgements and thanking all those that make the work that I'm going to talk about today here possible. So actually my doctoral advisors, Dr. Sarah Brownell and Dr. Katie Cooper at Arizona State University. Some of this work was funded by an NSF IUSE grant that made this work possible, along with some other collaborators, Kristen Parrish, Frank Guerrero, and Danielle Pace. So to begin, I want to just set some background of what we know about students with disabilities in STEM. Students with disabilities are largely underrepresented in STEM, and some data from 2018 and 2019 suggests that although students with disabilities individuals with disabilities make up roughly 25% of the population, only about 10% of those are choosing to pursue undergraduate STEM degrees. And so some of the motivating factors for this work that I'll talk about is, despite this, there's been very little empirical work and studies to look at why students with disabilities are either leaving STEM or choosing to pursue careers outside of the sciences. And so I will argue through the talk today and discussion that there's a critical need to identify essentially persistence factors for individuals with disabilities in STEM. So just for the purposes of this work to kind of establish who we're talking about, we often define students with disabilities as those supported by a disability resource center at a college or university, including learning disabilities, physical disabilities, chronic health conditions, vision loss, hearing loss, and mental health and psychological disabilities is another distinction that I just want to add here. And then this is also noted with a bit of an asterisk, because students must have official documentation such as medical diagnoses or evaluations in order to be eligible for accommodation. So we actually might be, and we are significantly kind of underrepresenting the total population that could be eligible for services from a university. So that's something happy to talk about a little bit later too. In terms of kind of situating this work in theory, we can consider an experience of anyone, but in this case, someone with a disability from 2 different perspectives. One being a medical model perspective. This is disability as a result of impairment. And this is often a deficit approach that I'll talk about us kind of moving beyond this. This would be, for example, me as someone with a physical disability not being able to reach a lab bench, for example, and that it's the result of an impairment that I have in order to be able to reach something in particular. And this is in contrast to a more social model perspective that we're driving attitudes to shift towards societal and structural barriers that individuals might face. So that same argument, me and the lab, that would be that the lab itself is set up in an inaccessible way where we've set kind of lab benches at a certain height that may not be accessible for everyone. So I'll talk a little bit about this contrast in the data that we hear from students. Another really important note, colleges and universities are legally required, mandated to provide accommodations for students based on the ADA and Section 504. So this means that they have established offices or centers to help provide these types of services, both kind of academic and social. And now I'd like to make this argument to stick with us today that there's an assumption that a college STEM learning environment is something of a traditional lecture followed by a midterm and a final exam, for example. And so historically, that's what most of the accommodations DRCs are providing, and they're best suited to provide for students. But what I'd also like to argue today is that our college STEM learning environments have changed dramatically, especially in recent years. And this is with the advent of active learning classrooms or classroom spaces where folks are asked to collaborate or work together with one another. Online education, not only just due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but just general trends in trying to increase online course offerings. And then another context that I'm really passionate about, but thinking about authentic experiences, research experiences, for example, that students might participate in. So so you might see that we're moving STEM education beyond this traditional lecture into more of these interactive components. But this begs the question for today, and what we'll talk about is, to what extent are students with disabilities being properly accommodated as we alter and change our learning environment? So I have data from 3 of these different contexts, and this is not the only 3, but these are 3 that we'll focus on: being active learning, online education, and research experiences. So I'll begin with active learning. And so as many of you may know, there's been national recommendations that have encouraged college science instructors to shift from traditional lecture to more active learning. And for the purposes of this talk, we'll define active learning as engaging students in the process of learning through activities or discussion in class, as opposed to passively listening to an expert. And this emphasizes higher order thinking or group work. So what I'm doing right now is very much the traditional lecture. We're actually going to have a chance to do a little bit of active learning here today, but kind of moving more towards student engagement in class. And part of this is we know that these practices on average have shown to lead to positive impacts on student learning. So these are, in general, positive instructor behaviors that engage students in learning. And there's even some evidence that this might decrease achievement gaps between certain groups of students. So I'm a proponent of active learning. Like I said, we're going to do a little bit of it today. But one hesitancy is that there's been some previous research that indicates that how active learning practices are implemented and introduced in a class can create challenges for those who may be underserved in science. And some previous data and studies have shown that this can be particularly challenging for women, for our LGBTQ+ students, and students with anxiety. And this led to the hypothesis that students with disabilities might face unique challenges when it comes to doing active learning in the classroom. And so just to explore this, this is one way and one model to explore this, considering kind of triangulating the perspectives of stakeholders who are involved. We can consider the perspectives of students who are taking the courses, instructors who are teaching the courses, and or perspectives of DRC directors who interact and often serve as this bridge between instructors and students. And so for this study, the first study that I'll talk about, we do have data from the different perspectives, but for this one in particular, I'll talk about the perspectives of DRC directors who again serve as this bridge in many ways between instructors and students. So with this work, we recruited 37 DRC directors from large enrollment institutions. They did semi-structured interviews with us. We coded essentially themes in the data inductively and deductively. And then again, just a caveat here that this is data from DRC directors' experiences, not specifically any student experiences that I'll talk about later. But this is with essentially thousands of interactions they've had with students and instructors. We asked the following research questions. To what extent do DRC directors perceive students with disabilities encounter challenges in active learning? What accommodations, if any, do DRC directors perceive are currently being provided for students in active learning? And then more importantly, what steps can be taken to enhance the overall experience of students with disabilities in active learning? So I'll first start with perceiving challenges. And so in terms of awareness of active learning, it's actually interesting to see that 100% of directors were aware of active learning practices happening in the classroom. So they know that active learning is happening. And specifically, when asked about whether active learning is posed a challenge, each director was able to recall at least one instance that they had worked with a student who encountered a challenge. So yes, they're aware, but they also know that it's potentially posing challenges. And so now for us to do a little bit of active learning to start here, I want you to consider one of the following active learning components and how it might be challenging for students with disabilities broadly. So for components of active learning, we often, we break these into broader themes here, but one component being small group work, another component being clicker questions or like an audience response poll, cold call or random call, being asked students to kind of involuntarily participate and answer in front of the whole class, and then required participation or attendance. And again, I will show our types of disabilities: learning, physical, chronic, vision, hearing, and mental health. And what I'll do, just to simulate this, I'll give folks about 30 seconds or so to think on your own, and then we'll have a chance to discuss. So how might one of the following active learning components be challenging? Small group work, clickers, cold call, and required participation or attendance. I do want to be mindful of our time, but I want to give yourself a little bit chance to think. Okay, and then in the spirit of doing active learning, what we'll do is if you're in person, go ahead and discuss your ideas with a partner. And if you're on Zoom, go ahead and place any ideas in the chat. It should get really loud in here as we introduce ourselves and get to talk to each other.
Yes.
All right, now, if we could come back together here. Thank you all for this really great discussion. I've heard great ideas that have come out. And what I'd like us to do, I'm going to go through each of these and just essentially compare what you were thinking or discussing with what we actually found. And many of you will find that what you discussed is actually reported out here. So so I'll start going through our results here first with challenges with small group work. And so again, this is what directors reported to us. Oh, and we had an idea in the chat. Great, thank you for sharing. So with challenges with small group work, we see that students with both learning disabilities and psychological mental health disabilities may have difficulty with time engaging with their groups and sharing their ideas, especially when these are time tasked and not enough time may be provided to do so. I just heard this one come up, but students with physical disabilities may have a difficult time with group work based on the physical space and setup of a classroom, especially because we often do active learning in classrooms that are maybe not necessarily designed for group work, like a large lecture hall, for example. And then this comes out in a similar vein with students deaf or hard of hearing can have a difficult time hearing classroom discussion, especially when it gets really loud in something like a large lecture hall. Secondly, I'll talk about challenges with clicker questions. I heard several of these ideas come out as well. This is one finding we see from directors is that they report students with learning disabilities are not always given enough time to process an answer. And again, this is often a timed response to a poll, and they may struggle to choose a correct answer. Mona mentioned this one, but students with vision loss may have difficult times, especially if it's posed on a PowerPoint slide and they just post it up there, and the clicker to be able to see, and oftentimes or not always will an instructor read out the question to the class as a whole. So if you just post a question up, could be very difficult. And then, similar, Mona here, students with fine motor or physical disabilities may struggle to physically select or press an intended answer on a device. Challenges with cold call, random calls, or being asked to participate on the spot, for example. Again, we see this kind of recurring theme of learning disabilities not being able to process a question given time constraints. Also, maybe having difficulties focusing in class, and when asked to share out, may not be prepared to share an answer right there on the spot. And then this idea came up about anxiety, but mental health and psychological disabilities, this may only exacerbate some of those feelings of anxiety or fear of kind of being evaluated in front of the class as a whole. And then finally, as often a component of active learning is required participation or required attendance. And this we see in some ways across the board, but students with mental health, physical disabilities, and chronic health conditions may have to miss multiple class periods or may be unable to attend for one reason or another. And this can result in not receiving those points that are associated with participation. So then secondly, we wanted to know, well, okay, given these challenges, what is currently being provided for individuals? And surprisingly, and unfortunately, what we see here is that none of the 37 DRCs that we spoke with had any standardized accommodations for these practices. And so what this means, or what this meant, is they are exclusively developing these solutions on a case-by-case basis, which may seem positive, which in some ways it is, but we argue that some of this is problematic because compared to the more standardized accommodations like extended testing time or something for an exam, these individualized accommodations for active learning take more time, effort, resources, et cetera, on everyone involved in order for them to happen. And sometimes there's delays in providing these types of accommodations, and they might not even happen at all at any point during a course. And students may not be receiving exactly what they would need. And then finally, we wanted to know, well, what steps can be taken to enhance the experiences of students with disabilities in active learning? And with our data from directors and literature, we've come up with the following recommendations. So first, instructors being transparent about the types of activities that they're doing and sharing this information with both disability resource centers, so folks on staff, but then also with students to be able to see what could be appropriate. And this can be something in the form of putting this on a syllabus to kind of know what to expect even before a course starts. Secondly, we know, proactive accommodations may not always be possible, but we encourage DRCs and instructors to work with students as quickly as possible to help support this sometimes complicated process of seeking these accommodations. From the instructor angle, we also encourage instructors to think about proactive design of their course using a model such as universal design for learning, trying to consider challenges or barriers that folks might face and accounting for those in the front end to be kind of inclusive of all students, which includes students with disabilities. And then finally, we urge kind of more work to be done here in terms of standardizing what active learning accommodations might look like. And then as such accommodations can be developed, this could be shared across courses and across institutions. And then so in terms of the implications in active learning here, we see that overall, many of the challenges that were described by directors were from a medical model perspective disability, coming from this lens of a student has a challenge with a particular active learning exercise. However, some of these challenges could be revised or reconsidered from a more of a social model perspective, such as an inaccessible classroom environment is preventing someone from fully engaging in the course. And so what we argue here is that we would urge folks to consider a more social model when designing courses, such as thinking about what barriers students may face and trying to remove as many barriers as possible in order, in many ways, to reduce the need for kind of retroactive accommodation and retrofitting. So kind of guiding, using the social model kind of as guidance for designing courses. And I do want to just make sure we're okay on timing here. So in general, for active learning courses, coming back to our question here of to what extent are they being properly, or students being properly accommodated, we see that there are many challenges that are being posed as we shift from traditional lecture to active learning. But how do students with disabilities fare in online courses? So now I'll talk a little bit about the COVID-19 disruption of higher education, and also kind of where we stand with providing accommodations for online learning. So don't have to convince many of you, COVID-19 disrupted nearly all of higher education, moving from essentially in-person formats to either hybrid or totally online in 2020 and 2021. This created many challenges for all students, but again, particularly those who are underserved in higher education. And so again, this affected nearly everyone, or essentially everyone, but particularly presented novel challenges for students with disabilities. And so why might that be? We know that STEM in general has been described as unwelcoming for students with disabilities. We also know in terms of thinking about accommodations, folks in STEM often receive fewer accommodations than folks majoring in non-STEM disciplines. We also know that accommodations may be necessary, but this takes time and effort. This was a rapid shift to online, so there was very little time to consider kind of what was and wasn't appropriate. And then there might have been other issues outside of college or outside of the course that may have affected individuals with disabilities, and this likely affected the learning experience. So things like social isolation, employment, et cetera. And then so for this particular study and this work here, we're actually considering the perspectives of students. So we're interviewing students here, but considering what their previously established accommodations were and what this was like after the transition. To what extent did online education present unique challenges, and how, if at all, were they accommodated? And then finally, how, if at all, did the transition affect this overall process of being accommodated? So just a little bit of brief background on the methods here. We interviewed 66 students. This was from 7 different institutions, trying to get a level of representation where students were taking at least one STEM course during the transition online. A context for our sample here, about half of our sample reported at least 2 disabilities. This is consistent with prior literature showing that disabilities may co-occur. And then I will share some quotes here. I won't be able to read them all just in the interest of time, but I do just want to note that all the names that are provided are pseudonyms for the students. So we're not, we're protecting their identities here. I'll do one more active learning here. This would be kind of a think to yourself, just in the interest of time. But what unique challenges do you think the transition to online presented for students with disabilities? And again, I list their types of disabilities: learning, physical, chronic, health, vision, hearing, and mental health. And so for this, just in the interest of time, I'll just give folks about 20 seconds to think on your own, maybe what unique challenges did the shift to online present? Okay, and then I would have a share out, but we'll move on here. I would like you to think, though, kind of what you were thinking about and what we actually heard out from our students here. So our first finding is that, in general, students were unable to access the accommodations that used during their in-person courses. And so, for example, students described that they experienced a lack of access to something like distraction or reduced distraction in testing environments. And so I'll show a quote here from Tom. It's a lengthy quote here, but they're essentially describing how they used to take test at the DRC, and now they're at home and they're unable to have access to a distraction-free environment. Also, we see that extended testing time was not always properly administered for students. This is Ava, who has a chronic health condition, saying that the instructor had students with disabilities take the exam with the entire class. After the class ended, he just abruptly ended the Zoom call, but didn't specify where students with disabilities should go. Because he just ended the call, we didn't really know what we were doing. So in some ways, students with disabilities were left out of this testing process here. Another common accommodation was note-taking, and some students experienced a lack of access to that. This is Ethan here, who talks about not being able to have access to a technology that they might need. And he says here, if you're disabled, you really need to pay for all the extra things because you can't function without them. So then we wanted to see, well, how did this transition present unique challenges, and how, if at all, were those challenges accommodated? And what we see in general is that new challenges arose, and they likely would have benefited from additional accommodation following this transition. And specifically, students experienced issues with test proctoring technology that was often implemented after COVID. And Sal here with a learning disability, anxiety, for example, says the camera being on and recording me wasn't helpful because every time I looked back at the screen, I saw my face. You know, almost all of my previous accommodations specifically alleviate my anxiety. Yet, as we see here, this test proctoring is actually inducing anxiety for someone like Sal. Also, similar to what we're doing here, video delivery of information is not always accessible. And this is really important to note in terms of kind of how we can become more accessible. But this is Philip, chronic health condition and vision loss, says, transitioning to everything being online, I'm spending so much more time staring at screens, videos, and a lot of small print. Vision loss definitely reared its head and showed up a lot more in this phase of education. And then finally with this, we wanted to know, well, how, if at all, did the transition affect the overall process of being accommodated as a student with a disability? And we've found a number of factors, but factors that were related to both instructors and disability resource centers that delayed access here. With some being that instructors didn't consider students with disabilities and their needs when transitioning online. And Terry here, who has a learning disability, says I had to really fight with one of my professors to get accommodations because he's not very tech competent. So I really have to work hard with my disability advisor and just hound my professor to get what I need. I'm supposed to have the slides and I never get the slides, and then I just have to fight him for it. So what we see here is that some instructors weren't providing, other instructors may have been making assumptions about what was and wasn't appropriate for students. Alexandria here says the professor gave me less time, but it's unfair, I'm supposed to have double time. And because it's online, they thought the exam was going to be easier. It's an open book exam. So they didn't give me double time, but that's not up to them, that's up to the DRC. And so on the DRC's end, they also, students reported that they also didn't provide information about how to adapt their students' current accommodations for online. And Lydia describes this when she's saying it would have just been good if the DRC would have been able to show just what was available or just what is available for accommodations during COVID-19. I actually don't know if the DRC necessarily has things that are specific to online. So as we see, the DRCs, weren't necessarily providing this information. And so what this led to, and the challenging piece of this is that students had to self-advocate more than what they typically would, which is already a lot, but more than what they typically would for modifications to accommodations or receiving additional ones. And Terry, who we quoted before here, but Terry comes back and says, I definitely self-advocate a lot more than in-person classes, especially with getting my captions on time. Like my one professor I had to fight with, I've had to be like, hey, I need you to send these to the DRC so I can actually have the videos. So in conclusion with this study, and then we'll talk a little bit about research here. Immediately after the transition online, students with disabilities were unable to access what they were provided in person. So things like reduced distraction testing, testing time, and note-taking. The transition to online also resulted in unique and novel challenges that would have likely required additional accommodation. Things like closed captioning of video lectures, adapted test proctoring technologies, things that weren't always provided for students. And then what this led to is uncovering barriers that prevented students from either effectively or efficiently receiving what they needed for accommodation. And this could have been on part of the DRC and on part of instructors for kind of making these determinations and assumptions.
These are all very negative, which I think was the point, but
yeah.
Surely there were some positive things for some people.
Yes.
Like in my class, I never before provided recordings. Now
it's a staple
all the time, which I think is basic, more accessible. People don't have to travel, So did you look into
that's yeah. So some of that did come out. We wanted to, as a response, to try to think about challenges that students were facing first.
During COVID, because it happens.
Yeah, and then there's some ongoing work that we're looking at is essentially how folks have benefited and what instructors have done to keep as part of their courses after they converted online. So things like what you're talking about. Yeah.
Some good things
that
came out of the pandemic for accessibility.
Yes. And I think especially with like workplace environments as well, I don't have any of that to be shared today, but kind of thinking about what access needs and accommodations look like post COVID, and some of the things that we normalized, like working from home, for example, is now much more easier to advocate for than things. So so not included here, but that is great considerations as well here. And I will just and I would like to have a little bit of discussion after here, but I will just say that for this point, as we shift primarily back to in-person, there's still many courses that have online elements, hybrid elements, etc. So we actually don't know the extent to which we're fully accommodating our students. And further, colleges and universities, Brown, for example, Arizona State, where we conducted most of this work, really looking to expand online course offerings. So as these continue to grow, we need to make sure that we're considering what accommodations look like for online students with disabilities. Again, we see this medical model perspective coming up to your point here, that this is very negative kind of in terms of describing an experience. Talking about your own challenges, it's something wrong with me, is why I'm not succeeding in a course, for example. But we also see that some students mention that the responsibility shouldn't be placed on the student, solely on the student, but rather part of the system. So thinking about all the stakeholders that involved can be really helpful to think about what it means to be properly accommodated. So in the last 8 minutes or so, I'll just briefly talk about undergraduate research experiences that students participate in, and what accommodations look like in such spaces here. Just to give context, I'm sure I probably don't need to explain to many of you about undergraduate research, conducting research under the direction of faculty member or other mentor, for example, graduate student. One thing that is really interesting here is that it's been defined as a high impact practice that can lead to many benefits, especially around things like pursuing degrees, graduate degrees, interest in science careers, and specific benefits for what I often come back to, kind of those who have historically kind of been excluded from the scientific community. And so that led to an hypothesis of, what does undergraduate research look like for students with disabilities? First of all, just to what extent are students with disabilities participating in research? And then of the students who are participating, what is that experience like? And I know it's variable, in terms of the types of research experiences folks are doing and the types of disabilities folks have, but this was kind of an attempt to classify some of this as well. So first, I usually ask this as a clicker poll, but I will just say we collected data from essentially every life sciences. So I'm a biology education researcher, but life sciences department in the US that offers a bachelor's degree. We had over 1,200 students respond to our survey. This is 87 different institutions, kind of across the board, research R1 to PUI. And then on the survey, folks were able to choose their self-reported disability status from our list. This is what I usually ask as a kind of clicker style question, but I'll just ask, what % of life science students in undergraduate research do you think reported having a disability? A, 56%, B, 26%, C, 18%, D, 12%, or E, 5%. So like I said, I usually do this as kind of a think on your own and share with a partner. In the interest of time, just in your head, kind of think about what estimate you would say individuals with disabilities represent in research. And then I'll just show you some data here. So data from the CDC suggests, as I said earlier, about 26% of the US population identify as having a disability. There is some disagreement in terms of kind of terminology and classification of disability, but this is kind of the best, or as close as we can perhaps get. We have data from the NSF that suggests that about 18% of life science majors have disabilities. And then kind of the kicker here for life science undergraduate researchers, that number drops down to about 12%. And then if we're actually going to exclude mental health, which is over half of our students, this number drops to only about 5% of students. So we see kind of this gradual or increasing lack of representation in research, where only about 5% of students with disabilities identify as doing research. So then we wanted to know what the experiences are like here. I'm gonna move somewhat quickly through this just to leave us at our time. But we wanted to see what unique challenges students were experiencing, how they navigated such challenges, what benefits, and this is coming back to introducing some of these points of benefit of doing research, and then what unique ways students with disabilities contribute to the research community. So then we follow just methods really quick. We followed up with the folks who participated in the survey, asked them to do an interview. Students with disabilities reported at least one disability, about half mental health, half learning, a quarter 20 chronic health condition, and about 20% hearing loss. And this was relatively similar in composition to who was surveyed. Semi-structured interviews, again, asking about their experience in research, what challenges, solutions, and accommodations, and what contributions they feel they bring as researchers with disabilities. And again, pseudonyms to protect student identity. In terms of challenges, I'll talk a little less here just for the interest of time about challenges, but students with disabilities experience unique challenges, especially around carrying out specific research-related tasks. This comes out, I'll share these quotes, but with flare-ups of a condition, as well as anxiety, being able to carry out something specific. Other folks with more concealable types of disabilities had challenges about revealing their disability in research. So this person talks about being uncomfortable discussing disability in a lab space, for example. And then how do folks navigate these challenges? And sorry, I'm going pretty quick here. But few students said that they received formal accommodations from a DRC for these accommodations, even though this is often part of a curriculum and even sometimes required for certain majors to do undergraduate research. So this person says they just didn't know that it was a thing, similar to what we see with online. And then also knowing about what accommodations could be possible if folks looked into it. We also see that this happened on an individualized basis, but this required some amount of self-awareness and self-advocacy on behalf of the student and the research mentor. So again, an additional barrier here. This student talks about not making sure that their mentor assumes anything about what they may need, and kind of advocating to make sure that it doesn't become a problem later. And then also some students required on their own creative solutions. And I think many of us here who've done research, this was something that I certainly did, which shouldn't necessarily have to happen, but kind of finding your own solution to a problem you might encounter. This person with hearing loss, for example, would always position herself in a way that she could hear her mentor, talking to her in conversation, for example. I want to leave here with us discussing a little bit about the unique benefits that students say. So in terms of unique benefits for participating, this is a neat theme that came out, is this idea of lack of representation in science can create a narrative that students with disabilities can't do science, but students report that undergraduate research can help them counter this narrative. And this student, Tia, says, because of my anxiety and the very bad situation with math courses, I really thought I wasn't able to do any amount of research. I didn't even think it was a possibility. I thought it was going to be too hard for me to deal with. And it turns out that it wasn't, and I actually flourished. And now I want to seek it out as a future career. So we see having an authentic experience like research could actually change some of their career trajectories here. And then finally, what unique ways do students contribute to undergraduate research community? This is really interesting to think about kind of their own capital and kind of wealth that they bring to a research experience, and recognizing kind of those particular benefits. So these students describe that their unique perspective brings something unique to the research community. Olive here says, I think having a disability gives me an advantage and it brings more diversity to the table and a unique perspective. I'm not only seeing what some people see inside the box, I like to think outside the box pretty freely. Some of the research ideas I think about are things that they've never really considered. And then also students reported a greater sense of empathy or understanding for the research process because of their own experiences with disability. And this is a unique quote here from Jesse, who identifies with having autism, but he says, I wanted to do research on autism because I am disabled. And I know autistic people have different experiences, but there's a lot of similarities and a lot of things that two people with the same disorder might both experience. So I'll just run through this super quick, but in conclusion, we see this overall underrepresentation of students with disabilities in research. Students who do participate may experience unique challenges that may be mitigated by revealing a disability or self-advocating for accommodation, maybe more than what they typically would. Students also experience these unique benefits, such as counteracting narratives of doing science, of being able to do science, and offering unique insights on research projects. So coming back to this in general, I know I did speak from a perspective of challenge here in a lot of these situations, but in general, we're seeing that there's an overall lack of accommodation, proper accommodation in these three learning environments. And I just want to argue that learning environments are only going to continue to change, but we need to make sure that we're changing with proper accommodation as well. And so just as our model here, most directors and students kind of consider things from a medical model perspective. But I would really argue that we, and some students mentioned this, but really thinking about how we can think about the scientific curriculum and community from a more social model perspective for accommodating folks. And so some amount of disability justice approach that would take both of these into accounts could really help advance access and inclusion, and really thinking about the priorities of other underrepresented groups and model that for individuals with disabilities. And then just my final slide here, accommodations look drastic, or science education looks drastically different than it did even just 30 or 50 years ago. Technology is going to make that even more drastic. If we don't consider what appropriate accommodations are for students as our learning environments evolve, we're doing one of three things. First, we're not meeting legal mandates for access that I talked about in the very beginning. But more importantly, we're not supporting a group that's already underrepresented and underserved in science. And finally, and I think what I'm most empowered by is that we're moving further and further away of an ultimate goal of creating more diverse and inclusive scientific communities that include individuals with disabilities. So with that, I'll thank the folks who helped make this work possible again. And I have my contact info, Logan_Jen@brown.edu. If you have any questions, I'm also happy to share slides and such. So thank you all. Yes. I'm sorry I had to go quick at the end. Yeah, questions. Yes.
You're a Sun Devil.
Yeah, yes.
I'm a Wildcat.
Oh no, boo, no.
So when you were talking about like taking more proactive approaches to kind of creating like accommodations in like a lab space or a classroom, etc., I mean that makes total sense.
Yeah.
I think like one thing that happens is like maybe from a professor or instructor point of view, because they don't have maybe a particular disability, they don't realize that it needs to be accommodated for. So like how do we kind of increase, it's more like maybe increasing awareness or things like that, just so that way maybe just because like people maybe want to be proactive, but then they unfortunately don't even realize that someone's struggling with X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, and I think it's a cultural shift and kind of community shift of really thinking about what it means to include individuals with disabilities. And I think we're starting to move the needle and thinking about first of all, even considering that individuals with disabilities are going into science and things. One of the challenging things is a lot of the legislation comes out of even just K-12 access for education, and not necessarily some of it makes the assumption that K-12 is the end of individual with disabilities career in education, right? So what does that look like at the higher education level? What does it look like in employment level, going into a research space, working with a professor, right, as an undergraduate researcher. So I think some of it is kind of cultural shift as we, see more and more individuals kind of doing science who have disabilities, but also, kind of providing that amount of awareness that they're in our classrooms or in our spaces, showing data like this, but what does it take to kind of get them, to kind of that next step of joining a research group and that sort of thing. There are some kind of general training type materials that have been developed for kind of mentoring and such, but I think we need to move a bit further than that, and there's even some access barriers to getting into a research experience that I didn't really talk about here, that of the students who aren't doing research, why are they not doing research, right? And is it a real barrier or a perceived barrier that may be preventing that, where it's like, oh, I applied for a lab, the PI didn't know how to accommodate, and I wasn't selected for the position, which hopefully that's not the story that we're telling, but I think that could be something to consider as well. But kind of turning that on its head of the unique benefits and things of actually engaging in that first experience could be really helpful. But yeah.
Before we take any more questions, thank you, Logan,
Yes.
for giving us such beautiful and unique insight on active learning and online education and research. And so those of you who have any questions for Logan, I'll make sure to put his email ID and handles on our Instagram, ally_edu.
Oh, great.
And also you can stay back and interact with Logan if you wish to, and if you have time. Being respectful of everyone's time, let me just thank everyone. Thank you, Logan, for taking time and being present here.
No, and thank you for having me. Yeah, and I'll be around until 3:30. Mona and I were meeting, but I'm happy to chat for another 20 minutes or so. Are we still meeting at 3? Okay, yes. You have a meeting though until, okay.
Next event is going to be on the 12th of April. It's by an autistic speech language pathologist called Rachel Dorsey. So it's in the same place, same time.
Oh, cool.
See you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you for joining us today on our journey to empower graduate students with disabilities in STEM education. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on our mission to foster inclusivity in evolving learning environments. Together, let's continue breaking barriers and creating a brighter future for all. See you at the next event.